I wasn't supposed to see the text messages on his phone. My son had left it face up on the kitchen counter while he went to grab his coat. That's when the notification lit up the screen. A message from his fiancée Vanessa about their honeymoon plans to Bali. And please don't tell your mom the resort name this time. Last thing we need is her trying to tag along. She's sweet, but way too old for that kind of travel. Remember how exhausted she got just walking around the farmer's market? Imagine her trying to climb temple stairs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I felt my chest tighten as I stepped away from the phone, pretending I hadn't seen anything when David returned. I smiled and hugged him goodbye, the cream-colored travel journal I'd bought him still in my handbag, the one filled with recommendations from my backpacking days across Southeast Asia. The same journal he once begged me to create when he was in college and dreamed of adventures like Mom had. As I drove home that evening, the words kept replaying in my mind. Too old for that kind of travel. I was only 63. And what Vanessa didn't know, what my own son had apparently forgotten, was that those temple stairs she mentioned. I'd climbed them 3 times in my lifetime already. I sat in my driveway for nearly half an hour, unable to go inside, watching the neighbors' children chase each other through sprinklers despite the cool autumn air. Their laughter floated across the yard, reminding me of David when he was small, when he thought I hung the moon and stars, when he proudly told his friends that his mom had ridden elephants in Thailand and slept under the stars in Morocco. I could have called him. I could have confronted him about the message. I could have reminded him that I had once trekked the Inca Trail at an elevation that made seasoned hikers turn back. But something stopped me. Perhaps pride? Perhaps the realization that my son no longer saw me as the adventurous woman I'd always been. So instead, I made a decision that would change everything between us. I went inside, opened my laptop, and booked the presidential suite at the Amankila Resort in Bali for the exact same dates as their honeymoon. The confirmation email arrived moments later, the most expensive, impulsive purchase I'd made in my life. And as I stared at the screen, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years began to stir within me. Defiance. Before we go any further, drop a comment below if you've ever been underestimated because of your age. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power. Because what happened after I booked that suite, what I discovered about myself and my son, no one, especially Vanessa, could have predicted. My name is Eleanor Winters. Before retirement, I spent 35 years as an international correspondent for Global News Network. Not the face on the screen, I was always behind the camera, traveling to over 60 countries, documenting revolutions, natural disasters, and human triumphs in places most people only read about in headlines. I lived out of a backpack for months at a time, slept on floors, in tents, once in an abandoned train car during a snowstorm in Romania. I spoke 4 languages fluently and could order a meal in a dozen more. I didn't just survive in those environments. I thrived. My colleagues called me Ellie the Unstoppable. My editors knew I would get the story no matter how remote or difficult the conditions. I climbed mountains, forded rivers, and navigated war zones, not for the adrenaline, but for the stories that needed telling. Then my husband Michael died suddenly of an aneurysm when David was only 10, and everything changed. I took a position at headquarters in Boston, traded my backpack for a briefcase, my hiking boots for sensible pumps. I became the editor who sent others to the places I once explored. I did it without hesitation. David needed stability, not a mother who disappeared for weeks on foreign assignments. I remember the day I accepted the desk job. I packed away my passport with its dog-eared pages and colorful stamps, carefully folded my lightweight travel clothes, and stored my camera equipment in the attic. David watched me from the doorway, his small face solemn. "Are you sad, Mom?" he asked. "No, sweetheart," I told him, though my chest ached. "I'm just changing adventures." And I meant it. Raising him became my new expedition. Less dramatic, perhaps, but no less meaningful. I channeled my energy into creating a home, filled with stories and mementos from around the world. Our weekends became mini adventures. Camping trips to the White Mountains, exploring hidden corners of the city, cooking dishes from countries he couldn't yet pronounce. As David grew, so did his fascination with my former life. He'd sit cross-legged on the floor as I showed him photographs, the sunrise over Angkor Wat, the stillness of the Sahara, the crowded markets of Marrakesh. "When I grow up," he'd declare, "I'm going to see every place you've been, Mom." I believed him. I believed in him. And for many years, I believed we shared the same appreciation for a life lived boldly. David flourished into a thoughtful, curious, young man. He studied international business, spent a semester abroad in Barcelona, and landed a job with a consulting firm that occasionally sent him to European capitals. Nothing too adventurous, mostly conference rooms and hotels, but he'd always call me from these trips, excited to share observations about the culture, the food, the people. "I get it now, Mom," he told me once after returning from his first business trip to Tokyo. "I understand why you love this life so much." That connection, that mutual understanding, meant everything to me. Even as I settled into middle age, and then beyond, I kept my adventurous spirit alive. I took cooking classes, learned ballroom dancing, joined a hiking group for weekend excursions. I wasn't scaling Kilimanjaro anymore, but I wasn't fading away either. Then David met Vanessa 3 years ago. She was beautiful, ambitious, and meticulous, a corporate event planner who transformed chaotic visions into pristine realities. When David first brought her to dinner, I welcomed her warmly, making my famous paella, a recipe I'd learned from an old woman in a coastal Spanish village. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is interesting," Vanessa said, picking carefully at the saffron rice. "So different from the paella at La Valenciana." I smiled, explaining that regional variations existed throughout Spain. She nodded politely, but left most of her plate untouched. Later that evening, I brought out a bottle of Moroccan wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. "David tells me you're planning a trip to Marrakesh next year," I said, pouring her a glass. "I spent 6 months there in the 90s. I'd be happy to share some recommendations for places most tourists never find." Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with David. "Oh, we're not really the off-the-beaten-path types," she said with a light laugh. "We prefer curated experiences. You know, 5-star accommodations, English-speaking guides, that sort of thing." "Mom was different," David jumped in. "She was fearless, slept anywhere, ate anything." The way he said it, in past tense, as if that woman no longer existed, made something shift inside me. A small displacement, barely perceptible, like the first pebble before a landslide. "I still am," I said quietly, but they had already moved on to discussing their preferred hotel chains. That evening marked the beginning of a subtle transformation in my relationship with David. It wasn't dramatic or hostile, rather a gradual reshaping, a gentle erosion of how he perceived me. Where once he had seen capability and adventure, he now saw age and fragility. Where once he sought my worldly wisdom, he now offered simplified explanations about places I'd lived and worked before he was born. The shift became more pronounced after their engagement. Suddenly, my suggestions for the wedding were traditional or dated. My offers to help with planning were met with kind but firm deflections. "We've got it handled, Mom. Don't worry yourself. Don't worry yourself." As if concern was the only emotion I was capable of experiencing now. There was a day, about 6 months after their engagement, when I met them for brunch at a new Mediterranean restaurant downtown. I was running late. My contemporary literature book club had gone over time with a passionate debate about Zadie Smith, and I arrived slightly breathless. My cheeks flushed from hurrying. "Mom, are you okay?" David asked immediately, rising to pull out my chair. "Maybe you should slow down a bit." I laughed. "I'm fine, just excited about getting here. You wouldn't believe the discussion we had about white teeth today." Vanessa smiled politely. "How's your book club going? It must be nice to have quiet activities to fill your time." Quiet activities, as if reading contemporary fiction was the equivalent of knitting slippers by the fireplace. "Actually," I said, unfolding my napkin, "we're quite rowdy." Margaret nearly threw her coffee at Richard when he suggested the protagonist was unsympathetic. They both chuckled, but in that indulgent way one might laugh at a child's exaggeration. The conversation shifted to their wedding plans, the caterer, the florist, the DJ, and I listened attentively, offering a comment here and there. When the topic turned to their honeymoon, I perked up. "Have you decided on a destination?" I asked. "We're thinking Southeast Asia," David said. "See, maybe Thailand or Indonesia." "Oh," my eyes lit up. "I have so many connections in that region still. My old colleague Sanjay runs an eco-resort in northern Thailand now, and Mei Lin, you remember me telling you about her? The photographer? She has a beautiful compound in Ubud. I could reach out." "That's really sweet, Mom," Vanessa interjected, placing her hand over mine. "But we're looking at more. Contemporary accommodations. You know, places with proper air conditioning, security, Western amenities." "Maylin's place has all of those things," I began, but David was already nodding in agreement with Vanessa. "We just want something easy, Mom. Not everyone can rough it like you did in your day." "In my day." As if my experiences belonged to a different geological era. I nodded and smiled, but inside, something was crumbling. Not just my connection to David, but my understanding of how he saw me. In his eyes, I had somehow transformed from Ellie the Unstoppable into Eleanor the Elderly. The brunch continued pleasantly enough, but a new awareness had settled over me, heavy and uncomfortable as a wet wool coat. When we parted, David insisted on walking me to my car, taking my elbow as if I might stumble on the perfectly flat sidewalk. "You know," he said as I unlocked my door, "we worry about you living alone in that big house. Vanessa's aunt moved into a really nice retirement community last year, very active, lots of people your age." I stared at him. "I'm 63, David, and I'm in perfect health." "Of course you are," he said quickly. "But it never hurts to plan ahead, right?" I drove home in silence, his words echoing in my mind. People your age. Plan ahead. The implications were clear. In my son's mind, I had crossed some invisible threshold into a category of human that needed management rather than respect. The following months brought more of the same. Small comments, gentle suggestions, concerned glances when I mentioned trying a new rock climbing gym or signing up for a weekend kayaking trip. Each instance on its own seemed minor, even well-intentioned, but together they formed a pattern that was increasingly difficult to ignore. When I announced my plans to visit my old friend Catherine in Arizona for a hiking trip through Antelope Canyon, both David and Vanessa reacted with barely concealed alarm. "Mom, those canyons can be dangerous. Flash floods, narrow passages, extreme temperatures." "I know," I said, trying to keep the irritation from my voice. "I've hiked them before, twice." "Yes, but that was—" He trailed off, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to say, "when you were younger." "Catherine and I have hired a guide," I assured him, "and we're not exactly planning to free solo El Capitan." He relaxed slightly, but I could see the concern lingering in his eyes, concern that felt increasingly like doubt in my capabilities. The trip to Arizona was magnificent. Catherine and I spent 5 days exploring the sculpted sandstone corridors of the canyon, taking photographs in the ethereal light, and camping under stars so bright they seemed artificial. I returned home refreshed, invigorated, with hundreds of stunning photos and a renewed sense of self. I invited David and Vanessa over for dinner, eager to share the experience. I prepared a slideshow of the best images, printed a few as potential wedding gifts, and even made a traditional Navajo-inspired meal based on recipes our guide had shared. They arrived on time, complimenting the house as always. "It looks so cozy, you've really made it comfortable," accepting glasses of wine, settling into the living room with polite interest as I connected my laptop to the television. "Before we start," David said, setting down his wine, "we have some exciting news." Vanessa beamed, reaching for his hand. "We've finalized our honeymoon plans. 2 weeks in Bali, staying at the Amankila resort." "That's wonderful," I said sincerely. "Bali is magical. I spent 3 months there covering the arts festival in '97. The temples at dawn, the terraced rice fields, the traditional dance performances. The resort has a private beach," Vanessa continued as if I hadn't spoken. "3 infinity pools and a spa with traditional treatments. We probably won't do much exploring beyond the property. It's our honeymoon after all. We just want to relax." I nodded, swallowing my disappointment. "Well, if you do venture out, I have a contact in Ubud who leads the most incredible cultural tours. Let me find her information. We'll be pretty scheduled with the resort activities," David said quickly. "They have cooking classes and yoga and these sunset cruises. All very controlled. Controlled, safe, predictable. Everything my life had not been until I settled down for him." "I understand," I said, turning back to my laptop. "Shall we look at some canyon photos?" They watched politely as I clicked through images of Catherine and me rappelling down rock faces, wading through narrow passages where the sunlight transformed the water into liquid copper, standing triumphant atop rock formations with vast desert landscapes behind us. "Wow, Mom," David said finally. "These are really something. But weren't you scared? Those paths look pretty treacherous." "That's part of the thrill," I explained. "Challenging yourself, discovering what you're capable of." Vanessa tilted her head. "I suppose everyone has different definitions of fun. Personally, I can't imagine anything worse than sleeping on the ground at your—" She caught herself. "I mean, camping just isn't for everyone. At your age." The unspoken words hung in the air between us. The dinner that followed was pleasant but strained. They praised the food, asked appropriate questions about the trip, but I could sense their relief when the evening came to an end. As they were leaving, David hugged me tightly. "I'm glad you had fun, Mom, but maybe consider something less strenuous next time. Art classes or a river cruise. Catherine's probably getting tired too." I didn't tell him that Catherine, at 67, had recently completed her first marathon. After they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by images of my recent adventure, feeling a strange disconnection between the woman in those photographs, vibrant, capable, alive, and the fragile creature my son seemed to see when he looked at me. The pattern continued through the wedding preparations. I was included, of course, but in carefully managed ways. I was invited to the cake tasting, but not the venue selection. I accompanied Vanessa to a bridal salon, but was gently directed toward mother of the groom dresses in muted tones and modest cuts. "Nothing too bold, Eleanor," the bridal consultant advised after clearly receiving some signal from Vanessa. "We want something dignified and age-appropriate." Age-appropriate. As if turning 60 meant surrendering to beige and polyester. I selected a deep emerald silk with a modern cut that highlighted my still athletic frame. Vanessa's tight smile told me everything I needed to know about her opinion. The wedding planning consumed the next several months. I made myself useful where permitted, stayed out of the way when not, and tried to ignore the growing sense that I was being cast in a role I didn't recognize. The sweet, slightly doddering mother who needed to be managed and accommodated rather than included and valued. Then came the day of the text message. The day I saw in black and white what they really thought of me. Too old for that kind of travel. Too feeble to keep up. A burden to be managed rather than a companion to be enjoyed. Which brings me back to my hotel reservation, the presidential suite at the Amankila, booked for the exact duration of their honeymoon. Was it petty? Perhaps. Impulsive? Definitely. But as I stared at the confirmation email, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. Not over them, but over my own narrative. I didn't tell David about my plans. Not when he called. The next day to discuss wedding logistics. Not during the rehearsal dinner where I gave a heartfelt toast about adventure and partnership. Not even after the beautiful ceremony when I hugged him tightly and told him I was proud of the man he'd become. Instead, I went home and began preparations of my own. I retrieved my old travel backpack from the attic, surprised at how familiar it felt in my hands. I dug out my quick-dry clothing, my compact travel towel, my first aid kit, and my beloved Nikon camera. I researched cultural events happening during their honeymoon dates, contacted old colleagues in the region, refreshed my rudimentary Indonesian. Each preparation was an affirmation, not just of an upcoming trip, but of an identity I had allowed to be diminished. With every item I packed, every plan I made, I felt myself expanding back into the fullness of who I had always been. The morning after the wedding, I drove David and Vanessa to the airport for their flight. We hugged at the departure's curb, and David held me a little longer than usual. "I'll text when we land," he promised. "And don't worry about the house while we're gone. I've asked Kyle next door to check on things." I nodded, not mentioning that I'd already arranged for my own house sitter. "Have a wonderful time. Bali is a magical place." Vanessa gave me a quick hug. "We'll bring you back a souvenir, something nice and easy to display?" I smiled. That would be lovely. I waited until their flight status showed departed on the airport app. Then I drove home, changed into comfortable clothes, and called a taxi to take me back to the airport, this time to the international terminal. My own journey would begin with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Not just to prove something to my son and his new wife, but to reclaim something I had slowly, almost imperceptibly, allowed to be taken from me. My identity as a woman of adventure, of capability, of boundless curiosity. A woman who was aging, yes, but who was far from merely aged. As the plane took off, I looked out the window at Boston receding below me, and I made myself a promise. This trip wouldn't be about spite or revenge. It would be about remembrance, remembering who I was, who I had always been beneath the roles of mother, widow, retiree. Ellie the Unstoppable was about to make her comeback, and neither David nor Vanessa had any idea what was coming. What none of us realized then was that this impulsive decision, booking that presidential suite, would set in motion a series of events that would transform not just how my son saw me, but how I saw myself. The journey ahead would challenge me in ways I couldn't anticipate, reconnect me with parts of myself I'd forgotten, and ultimately lead to a confrontation at that very resort that would change our family dynamic forever. But the first step was simply this: refusing to accept the limitations others had decided for me, refusing to become invisible, refusing to apologize for continuing to live fully in a world that expects women of a certain age to gradually disappear. The plane climbed higher, breaking through clouds into clear blue sky, and I felt a surge of exhilaration that had nothing to do with altitude. I was returning to a world I knew well, a world of discovery, of challenge, of beauty, and occasional hardship. A world where age was measured not in years but in experiences, in wisdom, in the capacity to adapt and overcome. Next to me, a young couple was excitedly reviewing their Bali itinerary, clearly their first major international trip. They reminded me of myself and Michael decades ago, when we were fresh-faced and eager, when the world seemed endlessly vast and welcoming. Is this your first time to Bali? The young woman asked, noticing my interest. No, I replied with a smile. I'm returning after many years. It's like visiting an old friend. Any recommendations? Her partner asked. Places we shouldn't miss? I spent the next hour sharing insights about hidden waterfalls, authentic dance performances, the best markets for local crafts. They listened intently, taking notes, asking thoughtful questions. Not once did they look at me with concern or doubt. Not once did they suggest something might be too strenuous or inappropriate. They saw me simply as someone with valuable knowledge to share. It was refreshing to be viewed without the filter of age, to be appreciated for what I knew, rather than accommodated for what they assumed I couldn't do. It reminded me of how David used to see me, before he began the subtle transformation of his mother from adventurer to antique. As our conversation wound down and they returned to their travel guide, I opened my journal and began to write. Not just about the trip ahead, but about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The slow surrender I had made to others' perceptions, the gradual acceptance of limitations I hadn't chosen for myself. I wrote about the wilderness years, after Michael died, when adventure took a backseat to parenting. I wrote about the pride I felt watching David grow into a man with curiosity about the world. And I wrote about the quiet heartbreak of realizing that the son who once saw me as limitless now saw only my limitations. The words flowed, page after page, until the captain announced our descent into our layover city. I closed the journal, feeling lighter somehow, as if the act of acknowledging what had been lost created space for what might yet be found. As I navigated the bustling international terminal, switching to my connecting flight, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. Not just for the confrontation that would inevitably come when David and Vanessa discovered me at their honeymoon resort, but for the rediscovery of a self I had too willingly set aside. This journey wasn't really about proving anything to them, I realized. It was about remembering what I had once known with certainty. That age might change the body, might alter the face that looks back from mirrors, but it need not diminish the spirit that has always defined who we truly are. My layover stretched longer than expected due to mechanical issues with the connecting flight. Rather than fretting about the delay, I settled into a cafe, ordered a strong coffee, and observed the human pageant of the international terminal, families reuniting, business travelers hurrying to connections, backpackers sprawled on the floor with their worldly possessions stuffed into canvas sacks. An elderly man with a cane sat at the table next to mine. He must have been well into his 80s, white-haired and slightly stooped, but his eyes were bright with interest as he studied a detailed map of Southeast Asia. "First trip?" I asked when he glanced up and caught me watching. He chuckled, a warm, gravelly sound. 23rd, actually. I'm visiting my grandson who's teaching English in Vietnam. Thought I'd make a proper journey of it this time. Vietnam, Cambodia, maybe down to Indonesia if my knees hold out. Bali, by any chance? I asked. That's the plan. They say the temples are something to behold. We spent the next hour exchanging stories. He was a retired mathematics professor who had begun traveling seriously only after his 70th birthday. Never too late to start living, he said with a wink. Though my children think I've gone quite mad. Keep suggesting cruises instead. I laughed, recognizing the familiar pattern. My son thinks I'm too old for Bali, too. The professor raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To disappointing our children by refusing to disappear gracefully, I clinked my cup against his. To aging disgracefully instead. When my flight was finally called, we parted with email addresses exchanged and a promise to potentially meet for dinner in Ubud. As I walked toward my gate, his parting words echoed in my mind. Remember, the greatest adventure is proving the world wrong about what you can do. That night, somewhere over the Pacific, as most passengers slept around me, I stared out the window at the vast darkness below. occasionally broken by the lights of ships or remote islands. I thought about the journey ahead, not just the physical distance to Bali, but the emotional territory I was preparing to navigate. What exactly did I hope to accomplish by appearing at David and Vanessa's honeymoon resort? Was I simply being petty, wanting to prove a point? Or was there something deeper at stake? Not just my relationship with my son, but my relationship with myself? The truth, I realized as the plane soared through darkness, was that somewhere along the way, I had started to believe the narrative others had created about me. I had begun to see myself through their eyes, as fragile, as diminished, as past my prime. This journey wasn't just about shocking David and Vanessa with my presence. It was about shocking myself back into full awareness of who I still was. As dawn broke over the Pacific, painting the horizon in strokes of gold and pink, I made another decision. This trip would not be defined by confrontation, but by celebration. A celebration of capacity, of courage, of the continuity of self, across the decades. If David and Vanessa witnessed that celebration, all the better. But even if they didn't, even if our paths somehow never crossed in Bali, the journey would still have served its purpose. I dozed off finally, lulled by the drone of engines and the certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, not just on this plane, but on this path of reclamation and rediscovery. The woman who would land in Bali would not be the same. Woman who had stood in her kitchen reading a dismissive text message about her capabilities. She would be more authentic, more determined, and far less willing to be defined by others' limitations. And as for what would happen when David and Vanessa eventually discovered me in the presidential suite of their honeymoon resort, that was a bridge I would cross when I came to it, with the confidence of a woman who had crossed far more treacherous terrain in her lifetime. The adventure was just beginning. And contrary to what my son believed, I was nowhere near too old for it. The Bali air hit me like a warm, fragrant embrace as I stepped off the plane. Instantly, memories flooded back. The distinctive blend of frangipani and incense, the gentle cadence of Balinese voices, the vibrant colors that seemed almost too intense to be real. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar sensations wash over me. 26 years had passed since my last visit, yet somehow it felt like returning home. I navigated the newly renovated Denpasar airport with practiced ease, bypassing the tour operators hawking packages to tourists, and headed straight for the taxi stand. The driver, a middle-aged man named Wayan, smiled broadly when I greeted him in rudimentary Indonesian. "You speak our language," he exclaimed, clearly delighted. "Sedikit saja," I replied, "just a little. I was here many years ago." We drove toward the eastern coast where the Amankila resort perched on a cliffside. Wayan pointed out changes, new developments, expanded roads, areas now crowded with tourists that had once been quiet villages. Yet beyond these modern intrusions, the essential spirit of Bali remained untouched. The careful placement of daily offerings outside shops, the emerald rice terraces cascading down hillsides, the ornate temple gates standing sentinel along the roadways. "You visit family in Bali?" Wayan asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I hesitated. "In a way," I said finally. "My son is here on his honeymoon." "Ah, you joined the celebration. Very good. Family is everything." I didn't correct his assumption. How could I explain that my presence was uninvited, unannounced, a deliberate disruption of a carefully planned romantic getaway? That I was arriving not as a welcome addition, but as a statement, a reclamation, a refusal to be sidelined? The complexity of my motivations felt too nuanced for casual conversation. Instead, I watched the landscape unfold and prepared myself, mentally, for what lay ahead. David and Vanessa had departed Boston 2 days before me and would already be settled into their resort experience. My plan wasn't to announce my arrival immediately. First, I needed to reacquaint myself with Bali. to shed the hesitant skin I'd grown accustomed to wearing and rediscover the confident traveler who once moved through these spaces with assurance. The Amankila appeared around a bend, a cascading collection of pavilions and suites nestled into a lush hillside overlooking the Lombok Strait. The architecture mimicked traditional Balinese water palaces with elevated walkways connecting different levels, infinity pools that seemed to spill directly into the ocean, and thatched roofs that harmonized with the surrounding palm trees. At the elegant open-air reception pavilion, I was greeted with cool lemongrass-scented towels and fresh papaya juice. The manager, a poised woman named Ayu, welcomed me personally. "Ms. Winters, we're delighted to have you with us. Your suite is prepared." I followed her along elevated walkways, past infinity pools where guests lounged with cocktails, through gardens bursting with orchids and bird-of-paradise flowers. The presidential suite occupied its own secluded section of the property, offering panoramic ocean views and complete privacy. "This is one of our most requested accommodations," Ayu explained, as she slid open teak doors to reveal a stunning open-concept living space. "Your private butler, Kadek, will be available 24 hours for anything you require." The suite was breathtaking, a masterful blend of luxury and Balinese aesthetic. A private infinity pool stretched along the terrace, seeming to merge with the ocean beyond. Inside, hand-carved furniture, local artwork, and sumptuous fabrics created an atmosphere of refined elegance. "It's perfect," I said, taking in the expansive space. Far more than a single traveler needed, but exactly what the situation demanded. After Ayu departed, I stood on the terrace, gazing at the horizon where the deep blue sea met an equally blue sky. The salt breeze lifted my hair, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt fully present in my body, in this moment, in this place. Not Eleanor the aging mother, but Ellie the explorer, awake and alive to possibility. I unpacked methodically, setting out my still serviceable travel gear alongside the few new items I'd purchased for this trip. My hiking boots, broken in from decades of use, looked incongruous against the polished marble floor. I smiled at the contrast. It perfectly symbolized this journey of reconnection between who I had been and who I still was beneath the layers of accommodation and compromise. That first evening, I dined alone on my terrace, savoring fresh seafood and watching stars emerge above the ocean. I deliberately avoided the main restaurant, not yet ready for the potential encounter with David and Vanessa. This time was for me, for acclimatization, for shedding the invisible constraints that had gradually tightened around my spirit. I slept deeply that night, lulled by the rhythmic sound of waves against the shore below. When I woke at dawn, I felt an energy I hadn't experienced in years, a lightness, an eagerness to engage with the day ahead. I began with yoga on my terrace as the sun rose, moving through familiar postures with more strength and flexibility than I'd given myself credit for. Then, rather than ordering breakfast in my suite, I decided to venture to the main restaurant. It was time to risk an encounter, to allow whatever was going to happen to unfold. The restaurant occupied an open-air pavilion overlooking the largest of the resort's 3 infinity pools. I selected a table with good visibility of the entire space and ordered fresh fruit, Balinese coffee, and bubur injin, black rice pudding, with coconut milk, a breakfast I remembered fondly from my previous time in Bali. As I ate, I scanned the other guests discreetly. No sign of David and Vanessa. Perhaps they were sleeping late. They were, after all, on their honeymoon. Or perhaps they were already out on an excursion. The thought brought a wry smile to my face. How surprised they would be to discover me here. After breakfast, I approached the concierge desk where a young woman greeted me warmly. "I'd like to arrange a visit to Pura Lempuyang," I said, naming one of Bali's oldest and most sacred temples, famous for its gateway to heaven, a split gate that framed a perfect view of Mount Agung, the island's highest volcano. Of course, Ms. Winters. It's about a 2-hour drive from here and then quite a significant climb. 1,700 steps to reach the temple at the top. She hesitated, glancing up from her computer. It's quite strenuous. Many guests prefer to visit. Only the lower temple where the famous gate is located. There it was again. That careful concern. That gentle nudge toward the easier option. But this time, it didn't irritate me. This young woman didn't know me or my capabilities. She was simply doing her job. I'll do the full climb, I said, with a smile. I've been looking forward to it for years. She nodded, making the arrangements without further comment. Your guide will meet you at 7 a.m. tomorrow. The early start helps avoid both the heat and the crowds. Perfect. And for today, I'd like to borrow one of the resort's bicycles. I want to explore the local area. Within an hour, I was pedaling along coastal roads, past fishing villages, where colorful jukung outrigger canoes lined the black sand beaches. I stopped to watch women in sarongs carrying offerings to a small seaside temple, the careful balance and grace of their movements a form of devotion itself. In a small warung, a family-owned cafe, I enjoyed a simple lunch of nasi campur, a mix of small dishes surrounding a mound of rice. The elderly proprietress beamed when I complimented her sambal in my limited Indonesian and insisted on showing me how she ground the chili paste using a traditional stone mortar and pestle. These moments of connection, unplanned, authentic, human, reminded me of what I loved most about travel. Not the luxury accommodations or curated experiences, but the unexpected encounters that expanded my understanding of how life could be lived. I cycled back to the resort in late afternoon, pleasantly tired from the day's exertions but energized by the experiences. As I approached the entrance, I saw them. David and Vanessa were just emerging from a resort car, dressed in matching linen outfits, looking tanned and relaxed. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment, I considered turning around, pedaling away until I could compose myself. But that would have defeated the purpose of my journey. Instead, I dismounted gracefully and wheeled my bicycle toward the entrance directly into their path. The recognition wasn't immediate. They were laughing about something, heads inclined toward each other in that intimate way of new couples. Then David glanced up, his expression transforming from amusement to shock in an instant. "Mom?" His voice cracked on the single syllable. Vanessa's head snapped up, her perfect composure crumbling as she registered my presence. "Hello, darlings," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "Beautiful afternoon, isn't it?" How did you—" David stammered, looking around as if expecting hidden cameras, as if this must be some elaborate prank. "I decided to take a trip," I said, simply. "Bali has always been one of my favorite places." "But how did you know we were at this resort?" Vanessa's voice had an edge to it, the implication clear. I had somehow violated their privacy. I met her gaze directly. "You mentioned it at dinner, remember? The Amankila. I thought it sounded lovely, so I booked a stay." "You just happened to book the same dates as our honeymoon?" The disbelief in her tone was palpable. I smiled. Fortunate timing. I had some vacation days to use before they expired. The lie was transparent, but I delivered it with such calm conviction that it momentarily derailed their indignation. A staff member approached to take my bicycle, bowing slightly to all of us before wheeling it away. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood, his response to situations beyond his control. "Mom, can we talk about this? Privately?" "Of course," I said. "But I've had a rather active day cycling through villages. Perhaps we could meet for a drink later? Say, 7 o'clock at the bar?" Without waiting for their response, I walked, past them into the resort, maintaining the unhurried pace of someone completely at ease. Only when I reached the privacy of my suite did I allow myself to feel the full impact of the encounter, the racing heart, the trembling hands, the bizarre mixture of vindication and guilt. I sat on the edge of my bed, breathing deeply, centering myself. The confrontation had happened sooner than I'd anticipated, but perhaps that was for the best. Now the pretense was over. Now we could address the real reason I had come. At precisely 7 o'clock, I entered the resort's open-air bar, a sophisticated space perched on the cliff edge with unobstructed views of the sunset, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. I had changed into a sleeveless maxi dress in a vibrant teal. That complemented my silver hair, which I'd left loose around my shoulders rather than in my usual practical bun. David and Vanessa were already there, huddled together at a corner table, their bodies angled toward each other in what seemed like intense conversation. They didn't notice me immediately, giving me a moment to observe them, the tension in their postures, the quick, urgent exchange of words. I approached their table with deliberate confidence. The sunset is spectacular, isn't it? They looked up simultaneously, their conversation cutting off abruptly. David stood, a reflexive courtesy that somehow made the situation more awkward. "Mom," he began, then seemed unsure how to continue. I sat down across from them, nodding, at the waiter who approached. "I'll have a martini, please, very dry with olives." After the waiter departed, a weighted silence fell over our table. I waited, letting the discomfort build. I had spent years filling uncomfortable silences, smoothing over rough edges, making things easier for everyone else. Not tonight. Finally, David spoke. "Mom, I don't understand why you're here." I took my time answering, adjusting the silver bangles on my wrist, a memento from a market in Marrakech decades ago. "I think you do, David. I think you understand. Perfectly." His face flushed. "If this is about what I think it is—" "I saw the text," I said quietly. "The one from Vanessa about me being too old for this kind of travel, about how exhausted I got at the farmer's market." Vanessa's eyes widened, her hand moving unconsciously to her throat. "Eleanor, I held up my hand, stopping her apology before it could form. "I didn't come for apologies. I came because I realized something important. I've been complicit, in my own diminishment. I've allowed you both, and myself, to forget who I am." The waiter returned with my martini. I took a sip, appreciating the cold clarity of the drink. "Who you are," David repeated, confusion evident in his voice. "Mom, we know who you are." "Do you?" I asked softly. "Because the woman I've allowed you to see these past few years isn't me. Not fully. You've been seeing a careful, edited version, one who doesn't make you uncomfortable by reminding you of her capabilities." "That's not fair," David protested. "We just worry about you." "Worry," I repeated, tasting the word like I had tasted the martini. An interesting word. It implies concern for someone vulnerable, someone at risk. When exactly did I become that person in your eyes, David? When did I transform from the mother who taught you to pitch a tent in thunderstorms into someone who needed to be protected from climbing temple steps? He had no immediate answer. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I spent today cycling through fishing villages," I continued. "Tomorrow I'm climbing 1,700 steps to the top of Pura Lempuyang. The day after that, I might go scuba diving. I got certified on the Great Barrier Reef in '92, you know. My certification is still valid. Mom, that's not safe?" I finished. For him. Neither was covering the earthquake in Yogyakarta in 2006, or the tsunami in Thailand before that. Neither was raising a child alone after your father died. Life isn't safe, David. It never has been. Safety wasn't what I was seeking then, and it's not what I'm seeking now. My words hung in the air between us. In the background, a guitarist had begun playing softly, the melancholic notes floating over the cliffside into the darkening sky. "What are you seeking?" David asked finally, his voice quieter now. I considered the question, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. Recognition, I said at last. Not fame or attention, but acknowledgement of who I am. Not who you think I should be at this age. I'm seeking the space to continue being myself without being treated as though I'm in decline. We never meant, Vanessa began. I know, I interrupted gently. You never consciously meant to make me feel diminished, but intention doesn't negate impact. Every time you simplified an explanation of a place I'd already been, every time you exchanged glances over my adventure plans, every time you suggested something less strenuous, you were telling me who you thought I had become. And gradually, I started to believe it. David stared at his untouched drink. So, you followed us to our honeymoon to make this point? I laughed, surprising myself with the genuine sound. It does seem rather dramatic, doesn't it? But I didn't follow you. I reclaimed something. My right to go where I want, when I want, without apologizing for taking up space in the world. In our honeymoon resort, Vanessa clarified, a hint of resentment still evident in her tone. Yes, I acknowledged. Perhaps that part was a bit petty, but it got your attention, didn't it? More than another conversation would have. A reluctant smile tugged at David's lips. It definitely got our attention. The tension around our table had subtly shifted. Not disappeared, but transformed into something more complex. A mix of discomfort, recognition, and perhaps a dawning understanding. I'm not asking you to cancel your honeymoon plans or include me in them, I said, finishing my martini. I have my own itinerary, but I am asking you to see me, really see me, not as the mother who needs protection, but as the woman who crossed rivers and climbed mountains and navigated war zones long before you were born. That woman isn't gone. She's sitting right here. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took my hand, his eyes meeting mine with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. I remember, he said softly. I remember watching. You pack for assignments. How you could fit 2 weeks of necessities into one backpack. I remember the postcards that came from places I couldn't pronounce. I remember being so proud to tell my friends that my mom was braver than their dads. His words unlocked something in my chest, a tight knot of hurt I hadn't fully acknowledged, until that moment. What happened? I asked. When did that pride turn to concern? He sighed, withdrawing his hand to run it through his hair again. I don't know exactly. Maybe when I started losing friends' parents, heart attacks, cancer. Maybe when Mr. Abernathy down the street had that bad fall and never really recovered. Maybe I just forgot who you were because I was so worried about losing who you are to me. The honesty in his voice moved me more than any apology could have. Vanessa reached for his hand, squeezing it supportively before looking at me, with new consideration in her eyes. I never knew you as the war correspondent or the adventure traveler, she said. I only knew the mother-in-law who seemed so different from my own family. More settled, more traditional. I couldn't help but laugh. Me? Traditional? She smiled sheepishly. I know, it sounds ridiculous now, but that's how you presented yourself around us. You never talked about scaling mountains or covering disasters. You made Sunday roasts and suggested department store china patterns. Her observation startled me with its accuracy. I had curated a version of myself that I thought they wanted. Domestic, conventional, unthreatening. My own inauthenticity had contributed to their misconceptions. You're right, I admitted. I've been editing myself, trying to fit what I thought was the appropriate role of mother and mother-in-law. That stops now. I signaled for another round of drinks. As the waiter departed with our order, I felt a subtle shift in our dynamic. Not a complete resolution, but a crack in the facade, an opening toward something more honest. Tell me about this temple you're visiting tomorrow, David said, leaning forward slightly. The one with 1,100 steps. I smiled, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. Pura Lempuyang. It's one of Bali's oldest and most sacred temples, built on the slope of Mount Lempuyang. The Balinese believe it's one of the 6 Sad Kahyangan, the 6 sanctuaries of the world that maintain the balance of good and evil. As I described the temple complex, the challenging climb, the spiritual significance of the journey, I watched David's expression. For the first time in years, he was listening without that subtle veil of indulgence, without the barely concealed concern that had become so familiar. He was listening as an equal, engaged with the information rather than the perceived frailty of its messenger. "It sounds incredible," he said when I finished. "Challenging, but incredible." "Life at its best," I replied. "Challenging, but incredible." Our fresh drinks arrived, and Vanessa raised hers in a tentative toast. "To challenging but incredible experiences." We clinked glasses, a simple gesture that somehow felt significant. The first acknowledgement that perhaps we could find a new way forward, a more authentic relationship based on who we actually were rather than the roles we thought we should play. As the evening progressed, our conversation gradually relaxed. We didn't resolve everything. There were still moments of tension, flashes of the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But something fundamental had shifted. I had refused to be invisible, and in doing so, had forced them to see me with new eyes. Or perhaps with older, clearer eyes that remembered who I had always been. When we parted for the night, David hugged me with a fierceness that reminded me of his childhood embraces. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Not just for the text, but for forgetting." "I'm sorry too," I replied, "for letting you forget." As I walked back to my suite under a canopy of stars, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, and wouldn't be with a single conversation, but because I had taken the first crucial step. I had refused to disappear. I had insisted on being seen. Tomorrow would bring the temple climb, a physical challenge I looked forward to with renewed determination. Beyond that lay days of exploration, of reclaiming not just my relationship with my son, but my relationship with myself, the self I had allowed to be gradually diminished by others' expectations and my own acquiescence. The night air carried the scent of frangipani and distant incense, the same scents that had greeted me decades ago on my first visit to this island. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the fragrant reminder that some essences remain unchanged despite the passage of years. Some spirits remain undiminished, if only we have the courage to recognize and honor them. In my suite, I laid out my hiking clothes for the early morning departure, my boots, worn from countless trails across continents, my lightweight pants with zippered pockets, my breathable shirt with SPF protection, my wide-brimmed hat, creased and faded from years of sun. Each item a testament to journeys taken, challenges met, a life lived beyond boundaries. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized that this confrontation, coming face to face with David and Vanessa at their honeymoon resort, wasn't the climax of my journey after all. It was merely the beginning. The real adventure lay ahead. The daily practice of living authentically, of refusing to be defined by others' limitations, of insisting on being fully present in my life regardless of the number of years behind me. The hardest mountains to climb are not the physical ones, I thought as sleep began to claim me. The most challenging journey is the one back to ourselves after we've allowed others to convince us we are less than we are. But it's a journey worth taking, one step at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time. Tomorrow, I would climb 700 steps to an ancient temple. But tonight, I had already begun the ascent back to myself. The morning of my temple climb dawned with perfect clarity. Not a cloud in the vast blue sky, just the faintest mist hovering over the distant mountains. I rose before my 5:30 a.m. alarm, my body humming with anticipation. After our confrontation the previous evening, I had slept surprisingly well, as if the mere act of asserting my true self had released some long-held tension. I dressed methodically in lightweight hiking pants, a moisture-wicking top, and my trusted boots. I filled my day pack with essentials: water, a small first aid kit, a light jacket for the higher elevation, my camera, and the offerings my butler Kadak had thoughtfully prepared for me to leave at the temple: small baskets woven from palm leaves, filled with colorful flower petals, rice, and incense. As I stepped out of my suite, the eastern sky was just beginning to blush pink. The air held that magical quality found only at dawn, pristine, expectant, ripe with possibility. A few early rising birds called to each other across the lush gardens, their voices pure in the morning stillness. My guide, Neoman, waited for me at the resort entrance. He was middle-aged with an easy smile and the lean, muscular build of someone accustomed to climbing mountains. He greeted me with pressed palms and a slight bow. "Salamat pagi, Ibu Eleanor," he said. "Good morning." "Salamat pagi, Pak Nyoman," I replied, matching his gesture. His eyebrows lifted slightly in pleased surprise at my use of the respectful title. As we walked to the waiting car, he asked in English, "You have visited Bali before?" "Many years ago," I told him. "When Mount Agung last erupted in the 1990s. I was here covering the story." This clearly intrigued him. Throughout our 2-hour drive to the temple site, we talked about the changes in Bali over the decades, the tourism boom, the environmental challenges, the efforts to preserve traditional culture amid rapid development. Newman spoke with the nuanced perspective of someone who had witnessed his homeland's transformation firsthand, appreciating the economic benefits while mourning certain losses. "It is balance we seek," he said thoughtfully as we neared our destination. "Progress without forgetting who we are. This is the Balinese way, to adapt but remember." His words resonated deeply with me. Wasn't that exactly what I was trying to do? Adapt to new stages of life without forgetting who I was at my core? The parking area at Pura Limpuyang was already filling with tour buses and taxis when we arrived, but Neoman assured me the crowds would thin considerably beyond the famous gates of heaven at the lower temple, where most tourists came only for photographs. "Many visitors, they come for the Instagram picture only," he explained with a gentle smile. "They do not climb to the top. The journey is too far for a photograph." We stopped first at a small pavilion where I donned the traditional sarong and sash required for entering Balinese temples. Nyoman helped me arrange the fabric correctly, explaining the spiritual significance of each element. The sarong represented groundedness, connection to the earth. The sash symbolized the middle path, the balance between material and spiritual worlds. Thus properly attired, we approached the lower temple where dozens of tourists queued for photographs at the iconic split gate. I paused to observe the scene. Young couples in flowing dresses and carefully coordinated outfits posing between the stone columns, handing their phones to patient guides who knew exactly how to create the illusion that the subjects were alone in this sacred space. "Would you like photo also?" Nyoman asked, gesturing toward the gate. I shook my head. "I'd rather experience the real thing than the illusion." He nodded approvingly. Then we begin the climb. The path to the summit consisted of 1,700 stone steps ascending through forest and clearings, with 7 temples positioned at intervals along the route. The first section was relatively gentle, winding through groves of bamboo and flowering trees, where long-tailed macaques watched us curiously from overhead branches. About 20 minutes into our climb, we passed a young couple heading back down. The woman, perhaps in her late 20s, looked flushed and was breathing heavily. "It's too much," she told her companion. "Let's just go back to the gate and get our picture." I smiled to myself, not in judgment, but in recognition of different priorities. For her, the photograph was the goal. For me, it was the journey itself. The physical challenge, the quiet temples, the experience of moving through this sacred landscape as pilgrims had done for centuries. As we continued upward, the steps grew steeper, the forest denser. Neoman set a steady pace, occasionally pointing out medicinal plants or telling stories about the temples we passed. I matched his rhythm, pleased to find my breathing controlled, my legs strong. Decades of keeping myself physically active were paying off. At the third temple, about 600 steps up, we paused for water and rest. The view had already become spectacular, the coastline stretching away to the horizon, Mount Agung dominating the western skyline, its perfect volcanic cone piercing the blue. "You climb very well, Ibu," Nyoman observed as I took photographs. "Many visitors half your age turn back before this point." "I've always believed our bodies are made to move," I told him. "To climb, to explore, to challenge ourselves. Age doesn't change that fundamental design." He nodded thoughtfully. "In Bali, we have great respect for elders. They are wisdom keepers, not burdens. Not like in some Western countries where old people are." He searched for the right word. "Hidden away." His observation struck me forcefully. Had I allowed myself to be hidden away? Not in a literal sense, but in accepting the diminished role others had assigned me? We continued our ascent, the terrain growing more challenging. In some sections, the steps were worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet. In others, they were uneven and required careful footing. Sweat soaked my shirt, but I welcomed the exertion, the tangible proof of my body's capabilities. Nyoman began, telling me about his grandmother, who at 87 still walked 5 kilometers to the local market twice weekly and insisted on climbing to her village temple for every full moon ceremony. "She says movement is medicine," he explained. "When I offer to drive her, she refuses. 'My legs are my freedom,' she tells me. 'My legs are my freedom.'" The phrase echoed in my mind as we climbed higher, a mantra for the next steep section. So simple, yet so profound. Our physical capabilities as the foundation of our independence, our agency in the world. We reached the 6th temple as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The crowds had thinned to almost nothing. We had passed only a handful of determined pilgrims and serious hikers in the last hour. My legs were feeling the burn now, my breath coming harder in the thinner air. But I welcomed these sensations. This was living fully, engaging completely with the physical world, pushing against limitations rather than accepting them. The final ascent to the 7th and highest temple was the steepest yet. In places, crude handrails had been installed to help pilgrims navigate particularly challenging sections. Nyoman offered his hand at one tricky passage, but I politely declined, determined to make this climb entirely under my own power. When we finally reached the summit temple, the sense of accomplishment was intoxicating. We had climbed for nearly 3 hours, ascended 1,700 steps, and now stood at one of the most sacred sites in Bali. The temple itself was smaller than those below but exquisitely peaceful, with ancient stone carvings and a central shrine where devotees left offerings. I stood quietly, catching my breath, absorbing the panoramic view of the island spread beneath us: mountains, forests, terraced rice fields, villages, and the glittering sea beyond. This vantage point offered perspective in every sense, geographical and metaphorical. From here, the artificial boundaries and limitations of daily life seemed absurdly small. Nyoman helped me prepare my offerings, showing me how to place the little palm leaf baskets in appropriate locations around the temple. As I pressed my palms together in respect, he led me through a simple Balinese prayer of gratitude for the mountain, for health, for the privilege of making this journey. We spent nearly an hour at the summit. I photographed the temple, the landscape, the play of light and shadow across the distant valleys. But mostly, I simply sat in contemplation, letting the achievement settle into my bones, integrating the experience into my renewed sense of self. The descent was physically challenging in different ways. The strain on knee joints, the careful placement of each footfall on steep, sometimes slick stone steps. But we made steady progress, stopping at each temple along the way to appreciate details we might have missed during the ascent. By the time we reached the parking area, it was early afternoon. My legs were trembling with exertion, my clothes damp with sweat, but I felt vibrantly alive, connected to my physical body in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "You have done very well, Ibu Eleanor," Nyoman said as we removed our temple attire. Many Balinese would be proud of such a climb at any age. "Thank you for guiding me," I replied, genuinely moved by his steady support throughout the journey. "This day will stay with me." On the drive back to the resort, I was quiet, processing the experience, letting the sense of achievement wash through me. I had proven something important, not to others, but to myself. I was still capable, still strong, still able to rise to challenges that would defeat many younger people. As we neared the Amankila, Nyoman asked if I would like to stop at a special place, a small, family-run cafe perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, known for its traditional jamu, herbal drinks with medicinal properties. "Perfect for after-long climb," he assured me. "My grandmother's recipe, good for muscles, for energy." The cafe was charmingly rustic, just a few bamboo tables set under a thatched roof, with spectacular ocean views. A smiling woman around. My age prepared fresh jamu in a tiny kitchen area, muddling turmeric, ginger, lemongrass, and honey before adding hot water. The drink was pungent, complex, oddly invigorating. As I sipped, Nyoman introduced me to the proprietress, Ibu Wadi, explaining in Balinese about our temple climb. Her eyes widened, then crinkled with approval. "She says you have strong spirit," Nyoman translated. "She asks if you would like to join women's blessing ceremony at local temple tomorrow. Special full moon ritual. Not for tourists usually, but she would sponsor you." The invitation touched me deeply, an acknowledgement of respect from a contemporary, a recognition that transcended cultural differences and focused instead on shared female strength. I accepted gratefully, arranging to meet Ibu Wadi the following evening. By the time I returned to the resort, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in spectacular oranges and pinks. My body was pleasantly exhausted, my mind peaceful yet alert. I headed straight to my suite, looking forward to a long soak in the deep stone tub, followed by a quiet dinner on my terrace. As I crossed the lobby, however, I spotted David sitting alone in the bar area, nursing what appeared to be a whiskey neat. He looked up as I passed, his expression a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "Mom," he called, half rising from his chair. I paused, aware of my disheveled appearance, dusty hiking clothes, sweat-dampened hair, the healthy flush of exertion on my face. Not the carefully groomed mother he was accustomed to seeing. "David," I acknowledged, approaching his table. "Where's Vanessa?" "Spa appointment," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Join me?" I hesitated, acutely conscious of my need for a shower, but something in his expression made me accept. I sat down ordering water with lime when the server approached. "You look," David began, then seemed to recalibrate. "You've been out exploring?" "I climbed to the highest temple at Pura Lempuyang today," I said. "All 1,700 steps." His eyebrows shot up. 1,700? In this heat? "Started early to avoid the worst of it," I explained. "It was challenging but magnificent. One of the most rewarding experiences I've had in years." He studied me with new eyes, taking in the vitality that emanated from me despite my physical fatigue. "I looked up that temple after you mentioned it last night," he admitted. "The articles all described it as strenuous and not for the casual visitor." "Accurate descriptions," I agreed, sipping my water, "but well within my capabilities." David was quiet for a moment, turning his whiskey glass slowly between his fingers. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," he finally said. "About how I've been seeing you, or not seeing you." I waited, giving him space to find his words. "When Dad died," he continued, "you changed everything about your life for me. I knew that, intellectually. But I don't think I ever fully understood what you gave up until I got older." "I made choices," I corrected gently. "I didn't give up anything that mattered more than you did. But after I grew up, went to college, started my career, you just kept living that smaller life. The one you'd created for my sake." His voice held a note of realization, as if he were working through this understanding even as he spoke. "And I got used to seeing you that way. As Mom, not as Eleanor, Winters who used to trek through war zones with a camera and a notebook." I considered his words, recognizing their essential truth. "I did settle into patterns," I acknowledged. "It was easier in many ways. Comfortable. I let your perception of me, everyone's perception of me, slowly define my boundaries." "Until now," he said, a hint of a smile forming. "Until now," I agreed. The server returned, and on impulse I ordered a gin and tonic. David raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I saw some of your photographs online," he said after the server departed. "From your reporting days. The earthquake in Gujarat, the refugee camps in Sudan. They were extraordinary. I had forgotten, or maybe never fully realized, what you did before you were my mother." The recognition in his voice, that I had existed as a complete person before motherhood, that parenthood had been an addition to my identity rather than a replacement of it, moved me deeply. "I've been researching some of the places you've been," he continued. "Reading articles you wrote. There was one about crossing the border into Myanmar with medical supplies that was just, I don't even have words. How did I not know these stories?" "You knew some of them," I reminded him. "When you were younger, you loved my travel tales, but as you grew older, you seemed less interested, so I stopped telling them. Or maybe I just took them for granted," he said thoughtfully. "The way kids do with their parents' lives before they existed." My drink arrived, and I took a sip, enjoying the perfect balance of bitter and sweet. "It's natural. We all go through phases of seeing our parents differently. First, they're superheroes, then they're embarrassingly out of touch, then maybe, if we're lucky, we start to see them as full human beings again." David looked down, a flush creeping into his cheeks. "About that text message." I held up a hand. "I didn't come here for an apology. I know. But I want to give one anyway." He met my eyes directly. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not just for what Vanessa said, which was thoughtless, but for how I've been treating you. Like you needed to be managed rather than respected." The sincerity in his voice touched me. "Thank you. That means a lot. Vanessa's sorry too," he added. "She's just processing all this differently. Give her time." I nodded, understanding the complex position he was in, caught between his new wife and his mother, trying to navigate loyalties and expectations. "I'm not here to disrupt your honeymoon," I assured him. "I have my own agenda. Tomorrow I've been invited to a women's blessing ceremony at a local temple. The day after, I'm considering a scuba refresher course." His eyes widened slightly at the mention of scuba diving, but to his credit, he swallowed whatever protective instinct might have surfaced. "That sounds amazing. Both things." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Then David asked hesitantly, Would you tell me one of your stories? One I might not have heard before?" The request, so simple yet so profound in what it represented, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I blinked them away and smiled. How about the time I got stranded in a remote village in Papua New Guinea during monsoon season and ended up becoming an honorary member of the local tribe? His face lit up with genuine interest. I definitely haven't heard that one. For the next hour, I shared stories of my reporting days. The harrowing moments, the profound human connections, the unexpected beauty found in difficult circumstances. David listened with the rapt attention of his childhood, asking thoughtful questions, laughing at the humorous moments, sobering at the challenging ones. As darkness fell and the resort lights came on around us, casting a golden glow over the bar area, I realized something important had shifted between us. Not completely, not permanently perhaps, but significantly. He was seeing me with new eyes, or rather, with old eyes made new again, eyes that recognized the fullness of who I was beyond the limiting label of mother. When Vanessa appeared, fresh from her spa treatments and impeccably dressed for dinner, there was a momentary awkwardness. She hesitated at the edge of the bar, clearly uncertain about joining us. David waved her over. Mom was just telling me about getting caught in a tribal war in Papua New Guinea. You have to hear this. Vanessa sat cautiously, her expression guarded but not hostile. That sounds intense. It was, I acknowledged, but also one of the most profound experiences of my life. I didn't repeat the entire story, but shared the conclusion, how warring tribes had eventually found common ground through a shared ritual, how I had documented the peace process, and how the experience had changed my understanding of conflict resolution. That's actually fascinating, Vanessa said when I finished, surprise evident in her voice. Did you ever write a book about your experiences? Because that would be an amazing read. I've thought about it, I admitted, but never seemed to find the time. You have time now, David pointed out, and the stories are obviously still vivid. The suggestion startled me. A book? The idea had flitted through my mind occasionally over the years, but I had always dismissed it as impractical, indulgent. Yet now, with both of them looking at me expectantly, it suddenly seemed not just possible, but appealing. Maybe I do, I said slowly. Maybe that's exactly what I should be doing with this phase of life. The conversation shifted then to dinner plans. To my surprise, they invited me to join them. I declined politely, genuinely needing rest after my temple climb, and sensing they needed time together without me. But the invitation itself represented progress, acknowledgement that my presence wasn't inherently intrusive. As I finally made my way back to my suite, I reflected on the unexpected developments of the day. The physical triumph of the temple. Climb had been transformative in itself, a tangible demonstration of my capabilities despite age. But the emotional breakthrough with David felt equally significant. One climb had led to another, it seemed. Ascending those 1,700 stone steps had somehow created a pathway for him to climb back toward seeing me clearly. In my suite, I sank into a hot bath infused with local herbs, letting the water soothe my tired muscles. The day's experiences swirled in my mind, the sacred temples, the panoramic views, Nyoman's grandmother who still walked kilometers at 87, David's renewed interest in my stories, Vanessa's suggestion about a book. Each element represented a piece of a larger mosaic that was forming, a new vision of what this stage of life could be. Not a diminishment, not a fading away, but a powerful reconfiguration of energies and focus. Perhaps even a flourishing that hadn't been possible during the demanding years of career building and child raising. After my bath, I sat on my terrace with a light dinner, watching the moon rise over the sea, nearly full, a luminous presence, ascending into the star-filled sky. Tomorrow it would reach completeness, and I would participate in a ceremony with local women, another step in this unexpected journey of reclamation. My phone chimed with a text message. It was from Catherine, my hiking friend from Arizona. "How's the grand statement going?" Has your son fainted from shock yet? I smiled, realizing I hadn't updated her since the initial confrontation. I typed back, climbed 1,100 temple steps today. Having actual conversations with David. Beginning to think this impulsive trip might be the best decision I've made in years. Her response came quickly. Of course it is. Sometimes we need to shock ourselves out of the boxes others have put us in. So proud of you, Ellie. Climb every mountain, literal and figurative. I set the phone aside, letting Catherine's words settle into my consciousness. Shock ourselves out of the boxes others have put us in. Yes, that was exactly what I had done by booking this suite, by appearing at this resort. But in the process, I was also shocking myself out of the box I had gradually, almost imperceptibly, accepted as my own. The realization brought with it a profound sense of possibility. If I could break free of these limitations, the ones imposed by others and the ones I had internalized, what else might be possible in this chapter of life? What other adventures, connections, contributions might lie ahead? I took out my journal and began to write, not just about the day's experiences, but about the emerging vision for my future. Ideas flowed freely. The book Vanessa had suggested. Yes, but also other possibilities. Perhaps mentoring young journalists. Maybe creating a travel blog specifically for older women challenging stereotypes about aging. Possibly even organizing small group adventures for people who, like me, refused to accept that exploration ended at some arbitrary age. As I wrote, a deep contentment settled over me. This journey to Bali had begun as a reaction, a defiant response to being dismissed, underestimated, relegated to the sidelines. But it was transforming into something far more meaningful, a proactive reclaiming of my authentic self. A deliberate choice to live by my own definitions rather than others' expectations. Tomorrow would bring new experiences, the women's blessing ceremony, perhaps more conversations with David and Vanessa, further exploration of this island that had welcomed me back after so many years. But whatever specific events unfolded, I knew with certainty that the inner journey would continue. This process of remembering and reclaiming who I had always been beneath the layers of accommodation and compromise. I closed my journal and looked out at the moonlight silvering the waves below. The ocean, like life itself, was constantly in motion, sometimes turbulent, sometimes serene, but never static. I had allowed myself to become too still, too acquiescent to others' definitions. Now I was back in flow, moving with my own currents, rather than against them. The thought brought a smile to my face as I prepared for bed. My body ached pleasantly from the day's exertions, the kind of honest fatigue that promised deep, restorative sleep. Tomorrow I would rise again with the sun, ready to continue this unexpected adventure, not just through the landscapes of Bali, but through the expanding territory of my own rediscovered potential. As I drifted toward sleep, Nyoman's grandmother's words echoed in my mind. My legs are my freedom. So simple, yet so profound. Our capabilities, physical, mental, creative, spiritual, these were the true foundations of liberty at any age. And I was reclaiming mine, step by determined step, just as I had climbed that temple mountain earlier today. The journey back to oneself, I realized as sleep claimed me, might be the most important journey of all. The women's blessing ceremony. The following evening marked another significant milestone in my journey of reclamation. Ibu Wadi collected me from the resort at dusk, dressed in a beautiful traditional kabaya with an elaborately tied sarong. She had brought similar ceremonial clothing for me, a delicate embroidered blouse in deep purple, a batik sarong in complementary patterns, and a golden sash to bind it all together. In the resort's lobby bathroom, she helped me dress properly, her deft hands arranging the fabric with practiced precision, securing the complicated folds with hidden pins. Then she presented a small box containing fresh frangipani blossoms. For hair, she explained, tucking one fragrant white flower behind my ear, showing me how to secure the others at my temple. The effect was transformative. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked younger or older, but because I looked authentically present in this cultural context, respectful yet confident in assuming these traditional garments. Cantik, Ibuwati pronounced with satisfaction. Beautiful. We drove in her small, battered pickup truck to a village temple about 30 minutes from the resort. Unlike the grand temple complexes frequented by tourists, this was a community, sanctuary, smaller, humbler, but vibrant with authentic spiritual life. Women of all ages were gathering in the outer courtyard, carrying offerings similar to those I had left at Pura Lempuyang, but more elaborate, adorned with intricate fruit, carvings and special ceremonial items. Ibuwati introduced me to several women, explaining in a mixture of English and Balinese that I was an honored guest who had climbed the Great Temple yesterday. The women nodded approvingly, including me in their conversations despite our language barriers, showing me how to arrange my offerings correctly, where to place my hands during certain parts of the ceremony. What struck me most was how these women, ranging from teenagers to elders well into their 80s, interacted across generations. There was no segregation by age, no dismissal of older voices, no patronizing of younger ones. Each woman occupied her place in the community with dignity, each contribution valued according to its merit rather than the age of its contributor. As the ceremony began, with chanting priests and the hypnotic gamelan music traditional to Balinese rituals, I found myself deeply moved by this experience of female solidarity that transcended cultural differences. These women didn't know my story, didn't understand the specific journey that had brought me to their temple on this full moon night. Yet they had welcomed me into their sacred space with genuine hospitality. The ritual itself was beautiful. Cleansing with holy water, prayers for fertility, of crops, ideas, creative endeavors, not just children, blessings for strength and wisdom. At one point, an elderly priestess moved through our seated rows, pressing rice grains gently onto our foreheads and whispering individual blessings. When she reached me, she paused longer than she had with others. Her weathered hand rested briefly on my shoulder, and she spoke at length in Balinese, her eyes holding mine with surprising intensity. Afterward, I asked Ibuwati what the priestess had said. "She say you have strong spirit but have been sleeping. Now you wake up." Ibuwati smiled. "She say this good time for new beginning. She bless your journey home." "Home to America?" I asked, confused by the phrasing. "No," Ibuwati shook her head. "Home to yourself." The simple profundity of those words, home to yourself, resonated deeply as we drove back to the resort under the full moon's brilliant light. The priestess, who knew nothing of my personal circumstances, had somehow perceived the essential nature of my journey. I had indeed been sleeping in some fundamental way, allowing my true self to be gradually obscured by others' expectations and my own accommodation. This awakening, this homecoming to myself, was exactly what had begun with my impulsive decision to book the presidential suite at my son's honeymoon resort. What had started as a defiant gesture was evolving into something far more meaningful, a reclamation of identity, purpose, and possibility. Back at the resort, still dressed in my ceremonial clothes, I walked slowly through the grounds, savoring the beauty of the tropical night. The full moon cast everything in silver light, creating an almost otherworldly landscape of shadows and illumination. I felt altered by the ceremony, not in any mystical sense, but in the profound way that meaningful rituals can shift our perspective, realigning our understanding of ourselves in relation to the wider world. As I rounded a corner near one of the infinity pools, I came face to face with Vanessa. She was alone, wrapped in a resort robe, apparently having just finished a late-night swim. Her hair was wet, her face free of makeup, the most unguarded I had seen her since we met. "Eleanor," she said, startled by my appearance. "You look amazing." "Thank you," I replied, touching the flowers in my hair self-consciously. "I've been at a women's blessing ceremony in a local village." "Really?" Her surprise seemed genuine. "How did you arrange that? It's not on any of the resort activity lists." "I made a friend," I explained. "Sometimes the most meaningful experiences aren't found in brochures." She nodded slowly, considering this. For a moment, we stood in awkward silence, the moonlight illuminating the space between us. Two women connected by David, but otherwise seemingly worlds apart. "David told me about your climb yesterday," she finally said. 1,700 steps. That's impressive." The admission seemed to cost her something, a concession that perhaps she had misjudged me. "It was challenging," I acknowledged, "but worth every step." Another silence fell, but less tense than before. Vanessa seemed to be struggling with something internally, weighing whether to speak or remain guarded. "I've never been good with mothers," she finally confessed, the words tumbling out as if she couldn't contain them any longer. "My own mother. She was always comparing me to others, finding me lacking. Nothing I did was ever enough." The unexpected vulnerability caught me off guard, this polished, controlled young woman suddenly revealing such a personal pain. "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. "That's a difficult pattern to grow up with." She nodded, looking out over the moonlit ocean rather than at me. "I think I projected some of that onto you. Expected criticism that wasn't coming, saw judgment in normal questions, and then defended against what you expected to receive," I suggested gently. "Yes." She looked back at me, her expression more open than I had ever seen it. "I'm sorry about that text. It was thoughtless and unkind." "Thank you," I said, accepting her apology with grace. "But this trip has become about much more than that text message. It's helped me recognize how I've been limiting myself, accepting others' definitions of what I'm capable of." Vanessa considered this, tilting her head slightly. "I never really knew you before. The you that David used to talk about sometimes. The foreign correspondent, the adventurer. I only saw the mother-in-law," I finished for her. "The older woman who seemed to represent everything you feared about aging, about losing relevance." Her eyes widened at my perception. "How did you know?" I smiled. "Because I felt it too. That fear of disappearing, of becoming invisible as the years pass. The difference is, I started believing it about myself." We stood together in the moonlight, two women at different stages of life, yet suddenly finding unexpected common ground. The realization that Vanessa's dismissiveness had come not from malice, but from her own insecurities, shifted something fundamental in how I perceived our relationship. "Would you like to have breakfast tomorrow?" she asked hesitantly. "Just us? I'd like to hear more about your reporting days. David says you have amazing stories." The invitation, so unexpected yet so genuine, touched me deeply. "I'd like that very much," I replied. As we parted ways, each heading back to our respective accommodations, I felt another piece of this journey clicking into place. What had begun as confrontation was transforming into connection. What had started as reclamation of self was expanding to include new possibilities for relationship. Back in my suite, I carefully removed the ceremonial clothes, placing the frangipani blossoms in a small bowl of water to preserve their fragrance through the night. I sat on my terrace, still buzzing with the energy of the ceremony and the unexpected breakthrough with Vanessa. Under the brilliant full moon, with the soundtrack of waves breaking against the shore below, I opened my journal again and began to write, not just recording the day's events, but exploring this emerging understanding of how our fears and insecurities shape our treatment of others. How age becomes threatening when we haven't made peace with our own mortality. how the journey home to oneself might be the most important pilgrimage of all. The priestess's blessing echoed in my mind, a strong spirit awakening after sleep, a new beginning, a journey home. Not to a physical place, but to the authentic self that had always existed beneath layers of accommodation and compromise. As I wrote, a profound sense of gratitude washed over me, not just for this beautiful setting or the luxurious suite that had begun as a petty gesture, but for the unexpected gifts this journey was offering. Reconnection with my son, potential, new understanding with my daughter-in-law, and most importantly, reconciliation with my own essence, my own capabilities, my own worth independent of others' perceptions. Tomorrow would bring breakfast with Vanessa, perhaps further healing, certainly more discovery. Beyond that, days of continued exploration, of Bali, of new possibilities, of expanded horizons both literal and figurative. The moon sailed higher in the velvet sky, casting its silver light across the restless ocean, a reminder that illumination comes in cycles, that darkness gives way to brightness, that what seems hidden will eventually be revealed. In its glow, I felt myself becoming more fully visible, not just to others, but to myself, emerging from the shadows of diminished expectations into the clear light of renewed purpose and possibility. Breakfast with Vanessa revealed a side of her I'd never seen before. We sat at a secluded table overlooking the ocean, morning sunlight dancing across the water. Without David present, without the performative aspects of her usual behavior, she spoke with surprising candor about her childhood, with a hypercritical mother, her struggle with perfectionism, and her deep-seated fear of aging. "I'm terrified of becoming irrelevant," she confessed, pushing her avocado toast around her plate. "In my industry, women start disappearing after 40. It's like there's this expiration date stamped on our foreheads that only executives can see." I listened, recognizing the universal fear beneath her specific anxiety, the fear of invisibility that haunts women across generations. "The secret they don't tell you," I said finally, "is that invisibility is partly a choice. When we accept the narrative that we're past our prime, we start to vanish. But when we refuse that story," I gestured toward the ocean, "we remain as powerful and present as that horizon." She studied me thoughtfully. "Is that why you're here? Refusing? To vanish?" "Exactly," I nodded. "Not just to prove something to David or to you, but to remind myself of who I've always been beneath the roles others assign me." Our conversation shifted to her career in event planning, her ambitions for creating a specialized agency focusing on sustainable luxury experiences. I shared stories from my reporting days, instances where I'd navigated male-dominated environments, overcome bias, created opportunities where none existed. "You never just accepted limits," she observed with growing admiration. "Not without testing them first," I replied. By the time David joined us, something subtle but significant had shifted between Vanessa and me. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition, a foundation of respect where before there had been only judgment and misunderstanding. The remaining days of my Bali sojourn unfolded with unexpected harmony. Rather than disrupting David and Vanessa's honeymoon, my presence seemed to enrich it in ways none of us could have anticipated. We found a natural rhythm, mornings to ourselves, occasional shared excursions, dinners together every other evening, where we exchanged stories and observations. I pursued my own adventures, a scuba refresher course that led to an exhilarating dive among vibrant coral reefs, an impromptu cooking class in a local village where I learned to prepare traditional Balinese dishes, a sunrise hike up an active volcano where I watched dawn break over the island from above the clouds. Each experience reinforced the message I had come to embrace. That age was not the barrier. Fear was. And fear could be acknowledged, examined, and ultimately transcended through action. The day before my departure, the resort manager approached me as I relaxed by the pool. "Ms. Winters," she said with a warm smile, "I hope you won't mind, but several of our guests have asked about you." "About me?" I asked, surprised. "Yes. Your temple climb, your scuba diving, your volcano hike. These stories have been circulating. Our older guests in particular are inspired. They're wondering if you might be willing to share some of your experiences this evening. Nothing formal, just a small gathering in the library pavilion." The request caught me off guard, but something in it resonated with the journey I'd been on. "I'd be happy to," I heard myself say. That evening, expecting perhaps a handful of curious retirees, I was astonished to find the library pavilion filled to capacity, not just with older guests, but with people of all ages, including several staff members. David and Vanessa sat in the front row, their expressions a mixture of pride and anticipation. As I shared stories of my reporting days, my recent adventures, and the insights I'd gained about refusing limitations, I felt a strange sense of completion. The circle that had begun with that hurtful text message, "Too old for that kind," of travel, was closing with me standing before an audience, demonstrating through my very presence the absurdity of such assumptions. Questions flowed afterward, not just about specific travels, but about deeper matters. How does one maintain courage in the face of society's expectations? How does one reclaim identity after years of putting others first? How does one begin, again at 60, 70, 80? I answered as honestly as I could, acknowledging struggles alongside triumphs, sharing not just success stories but the moments of doubt, fear, and exhaustion that accompany any meaningful journey. "The key," I told a woman about my age who had lost her husband the previous year, "is remembering that you've always been more than your roles: wife, mother, professional. Those aspects may shift or even disappear, but your essential self remains. The challenge is rediscovering that self beneath the layers of expectation and accommodation." As the gathering dispersed, David approached, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I had no idea so many people knew what you've been doing here," he said. "You've become something of a legend at the resort." I laughed at the hyperbole. "Hardly a legend. Just a woman refusing to disappear." "No," he insisted. "It's more than that. You're showing people what's possible when you reject limitations. It's inspiring." The word hung between us, inspiring, so different from the careful, concerned way he had regarded me just days earlier. In his eyes now, I saw not protectiveness, but admiration, not worry, but respect. Later, as I packed for my departure the following day, there was a knock at my suite door. A resort staff member stood there with a large envelope. "Special delivery for you, Ms. Winters." Inside was a beautifully crafted book, handmade with banana leaf paper, bound with natural twine. On the first page, in elegant calligraphy, "To Eleanor, thank you for reminding us that courage has no age limit. The guests and staff of Amankila." What followed were dozens of handwritten notes and messages, from elderly couples thanking me for inspiring them to take on challenges they'd been avoiding, from younger travelers expressing hope that they would approach aging with similar spirit, from staff members sharing how my interactions had changed their perceptions of older Western visitors. The unexpected tribute moved me to tears, not just for the recognition it represented, but for the profound realization that my personal journey of reclamation had rippled outward, touching others in ways I couldn't have anticipated. My final evening in Bali, David, Vanessa, and I dined on my terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular hues of orange, pink, and purple. We had come so far from that initial confrontation, from discomfort and resentment to genuine appreciation and understanding. "I've been thinking," David said as we lingered over dessert, "about that book idea Vanessa mentioned. Your stories, your insights about age and adventure and refusing limitations. There's something important there, something that needs to be shared more widely." "I agree," Vanessa added with unexpected enthusiasm. And I have contacts in publishing, through my event work. If you're serious about it, I'd be happy to make some introductions. Their support, so different from the dismissive attitude that had prompted my impulsive journey, warmed me deeply. I think I am serious, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. This experience has shown me there's an audience hungry for a different narrative about aging, especially for women. To new chapters, David proposed, raising his glass in a toast. To refusing invisibility, Vanessa added. To remembering who we've always been, I concluded, clinking my glass against theirs as the last light faded from the sky, stars emerging in the velvet darkness above us. As my plane lifted off from Bali the next morning, I felt none of the letdown that often accompanies the end of travel. Instead, a sense of anticipation filled me, not just for returning home, but for the new directions this journey had revealed. My impulsive booking of the presidential suite, initially a petty act of defiance, had evolved into something profound, a reclamation of identity, a rejection of imposed limitations, a reminder of my essential self beyond the roles that had come to define me in others' eyes. But more than that, it had transformed my relationship with David and Vanessa, creating space for authentic connection where before there had been only misunderstanding and judgment. It had even rippled outward to touch strangers, challenging assumptions about age and capability in ways I hadn't anticipated. 6 months later, sitting in my garden with my laptop open to the first draft of what would become Refusing Invisibility, One Woman's Journey Back to Herself, I received a video call from David and Vanessa. They were in Morocco, backpacking, through the Atlas Mountains on an adventure I had helped them plan. "Mom, you won't believe the village we found yesterday," David exclaimed, his face sunburned and radiant with excitement. "The women weave these incredible textiles using techniques that haven't changed in centuries. We thought it might make a great chapter for your book." "Or maybe you should come see for yourself," Vanessa suggested, her formerly perfect appearance delightfully disheveled from their travels. "We've met some amazing older women here who remind me of you, still climbing mountains in their 70s and 80s, still living fully on their own terms." I smiled at their enthusiasm, at the transformation in both of them since our time in Bali. "I might just take you up on that," I replied. "After all, age is just a number, and the world has no expiration date." As we chatted about their experiences, about my growing speaking engagements on aging authentically, about the community of age disruptors I was building through workshops and social media, I reflected on how far we had all come from that hurtful text message that had started it all. "Too old for that kind of travel." The words that had once wounded me now seemed almost laughable in their ignorance, their limitation, their fundamental misunderstanding of what age actually means in a life fully lived. The journey that began with a presidential suite booking had become something far greater, not just a personal reclamation, but a public statement, a rippling challenge to cultural assumptions, an invitation to others to question the boundaries they had accepted without examination. And as I waved goodbye to David and Vanessa, promising to consider joining them for part of their journey, I realized the most profound truth of all, that sometimes the most important destination isn't a place on a map, but a state of being, fully present, fully authentic, fully alive at any age. The presidential suite had been extravagant, yes, perhaps even petty in its initial motivation. But the perspective it had provided, on myself, on my relationships, on possibility itself, had been worth every penny and more. Some might call it a midlife crisis. I preferred to think of it as a midlife awakening. And as I returned to my manuscript, ready to share that awakening with others walking similar paths, I felt nothing but gratitude for that moment of defiance that had led me back, not just to Bali, but to myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.